Greetings, everyone. It's time for this week's edition of the Graha Yoga video subscription program, your lesson this week. And we're going to be continuing our theme of lunar yogas. Today we're going to be looking at probably one of the best known and widely recognized of the lunar yogas. I'm speaking now of Gajikesari Yoga. And you would have all received from me actually a written lesson already called Light on Yogas that discussed this yoga and gave 12 examples of it, various degrees of quality. And so there are just some things that I want to add to your understanding about this yoga and how to qualify it. And so starting to do that here, I'm going to pull up my screen. Most of you are probably aware that the name of the yoga consists of two Sanskrit words, Gaja, which is the Sanskrit word for elephant, and then Kesari, which is the Sanskrit word for lion. So it's the elephant-lion combination. And of course, the elephant is the largest and strongest beast of the jungle, and the lion is the king of beasts. So the connotation is here is that if this yoga is expressing itself in the most dramatic way, it can make a person a very prominent member of their community, of their society, of the world. In the same way that the elephant and lion are prominent members of the beast of the jungle. And, coming now to the definition of this yoga as given in Parashara Hora, because there are some additional stipulations other than just the fact of Jupiter falling in an angle from the moon. It says here if Jupiter is in an angle from the ascendant or the moon, and if it's in a conjunction with and or aspected by a natural benefic, and if Jupiter is not in its debilitation or in the sign of an enemy or combust, in other words, not in some condition in which Jupiter deteriorates, then the yoga thus formed is called Gajikesari Yoga. And the results given in Parashara Hora are the native born in this yoga will be splendorous, wealthy, intelligent, endowed with many virtues, and be a favorite of the king. Now, another main Parashari text, Paladipika, that you've heard me refer to frequently, speaks only of Kesari Yoga and doesn't actually include these additional stipulations. It's just saying that when the moon and Jupiter are in angular positions to each other, it gives Kesari Yoga. And the description there is the native with Kesari Yoga in his birth chart will be a lion-like destroyer of his enemies. He will impress the audience with his noble and lofty ideals. So there's There's some, consistency in the definitions there. In his behaviors, he will be both passionate and emotional. He will enjoy a long life with great renown and wisdom. Due to his valor, he'll get over every hurdle. And this is the effects that are stipulated in Paladipika. Now, in my experience, and I want to make a point about this, the additional qualification that's given in the earlier definition is very important because moon falling angular from Jupiter is actually a very, very common feature in a chart. The moon stays in a sign for approximately 2.5 days and is going to be angular to Jupiter at 4 times during any given month. Actually there'll be like 10 days approximately in which the moon is angular from Jupiter, which means that a quarter, maybe a third of birth charts are likely to have such a combination. But you won't see the effects of this yoga as given in the classics in many of these charts at all. It's only under certain conditions that you will see the effects. And what my Jyotish Guru K.N. Rao emphasized was that in order to see these kind of effects, Jupiter falling not in an angle just from the moon, but also in an angle from the Lagna is a situation that increases the potential quality of this yoga. And then that additional stipulation that Jupiter be under the influence of additional natural benefics, which of course are going to be then Venus and Mercury. And then also just everything else about the moon and Jupiter. So their house placements, the houses that they rule, and in particular, sort of the conditions that they are in. Do they have a source of strength? What are theirs? What other kind of associations do they have? Are they blemished by the additional influence of natural malefics? How bright is the moon? Always a condition about the moon that is something that we have to consider. So in qualifying these yogas, you have to consider in qualifying this yoga, you have to consider all these different points. And then, of course, for any yoga, to give its fruit, one must run the period and subperiod of the planets involved. And so major period of Moon, major period of Jupiter. My own experience is that the effects of a good Gajikesara yoga are typically more dramatic in the Mahadasha of Jupiter, although they can manifest in the Moon period as well, no question about that. What we're going to look at first, has been my procedure here, is to look at, you might say, really, sort of superior Gajikesara yogas, ones that are giving their full and expected fruit. And, probably the classic example of this, maybe overused in the tradition of Jyotish, is the chart of the Mahatma Gandhi, who led India's independence movement. Quite a great individual in so many ways. He was indeed a Mahatma, a great soul. So here we see the moon is both in the 10th house. I'm sorry, the moon is the 10th lord in the 10th house, but then from there, Jupiter falls in the 10th from the moon, but it's also in an angle, of course, as we see here, from the birth lagna falling in the 7th as it is here. Now, the additional stipulation that Jupiter had the additional influence of natural benefics is present here twice over. Venus, strong in its own sign as the lagna lord, is aspecting onto Jupiter. And then Mercury, also having a source of strength, directional strength, is aspecting on it as well. Jupiter is the sort of something of a focal point, obviously, of another major yoga related to the ascendant, which is Bhari Yoga, where you have planets in the 2nd, the 1st, and the 12th, and then also the 7th. That also can bring a very prominent, notable individual. So there are blemishes with regards to this Gajikesara yoga. You see the moon there is with the influence of the Rahu-Ketu axis. It's not a particularly bright moon. It's actually in a Gandanta position. Jupiter, and of course Mars, is aspecting onto Jupiter. I wanted to mention, as I was talking about Jupiter, that Jupiter does have a good source of strength. You'll see here that it's falling in its own sign in Navamsha. And, if you look when he ran his Jupiter period, it was very much later in life, starting actually around age 70, but it was actually during that time that he became known as the Mahatma for his involvement in helping to overthrow through nonviolent means, passive resistant means, the British rule of India and make India independent. This all happened, the main portion of that, when that happened, was in his Jupiter Mahadasha, which is also a dasha that in which he was assassinated. Jupiter becomes a Maraka here for this lagna, because it's also falling in the 7th house. Now, very different kind of individual in a very different kind of context. I'm showing you now the chart of the professional basketball player here in the U.S., Stephen Curry, who for the last 2 seasons has been the most valuable player of the National Basketball Association. And his team, the Golden State Warriors, have won a championship, within that time frame. Here again, we see Jupiter in an angle, both from the moon and from the birth lagna. Jupiter is very strongly placed here in the 10th house. It's very obviously coming under the influence of an additional natural benefic, Venus in this case. And it has a source of strength. If you see what's going on here with Mars, you'll see that it's in a mutual exchange with Mars, giving it strength from that standpoint. Just like Mahatma Gandhi's Jupiter, his Jupiter here is involved in other favorable yogas. It's the ninth lord in the 10th, so that's Raja Yoga by placement. It's with Venus. Jupiter is the ninth lord, Venus is the fourth lord. That's again an angle trine combination, so it's Raja Yoga by conjunction. And then, Jupiter's combination as the ninth lord with Venus now as the 11th lord is the Dhan Yoga. So multiple yogas forming by house lordship, but then you'll see that Jupiter and Venus is falling in the second house from the Sun with Mercury on the other side. So it's a part of a fairly good Shubha Upacharya yoga that it's involved in. So a number of yogas that Jupiter's involved in addition to the Gajikesari yoga, which, as we've talked about, is an enhancement and increases the ability to Jupiter to give certain kind of results. The moon here even is in the Lagna Lord in the seventh house, which is, again, an angle trine Raja Yoga by placement condition. If you see its position in the Navamsha here, you'll see that the moon goes into its exaltation sign. So this is, again, a real superior Gajikesari Yoga. Now, I just want to highlight and point out here that it's not been in the, he's not run the Jupiter period as of yet. Actually, all this is great success as a professional athlete has come in his Rahu period. But I want to highlight this because this principle that you've heard me talk about before, that whoever is the nakshatra lord of a major period lord, that nakshatra lord and everything that it's about, yogas it might be involved in, gives some very important clues as to what that particular Mahadasha lord can give, what kind of results. In this case, if you look at Rahu's degrees, 2919, you'll see that it falls into Purvabhadra nakshatra, which of course is ruled by Jupiter. So to some degree, the Rahu major period is giving the results of Jupiter and all the favorable strong yogas that it's involved in, including a superior Gajikesari yoga. So moving on here, some of you may recognize the name of Katie Holmes. She is an actress, a movie star. And of course, when Gajikesari yoga is formed where Jupiter is falling either in its own sign or its exaltation sign, it can produce a particularly good Gajikesari yoga, which is what we see here. She has a very beautiful combination of the Lagna Lord moon, strong in its own sign. In this case, quite a bright moon, past fullness, but still quite bright. And then it's conjunct Jupiter in its exaltation sign here. And of course, this combination is a combination both of the ninth lord and the first lord, giving a pretty nice Raja and Dana yoga as well. But Gajikesari yoga, and a superior one. There is some blemish. It does get the aspect of Mars, but that's the only, you might say, blemish on the yoga. Now, it doesn't have the additional influence of the natural benefic, but you'll notice see degrees of moon and Jupiter, and then see that falling Ketra from these planets is Venus. And so this is an influence of a sort, not a conjunction, not a direct aspect, but two planets very angular from each other. The Gajikesari yoga is based in part when Jupiter's falling not with the moon, but in an angle from it. It's based on the idea that those planets in an angular position do exert an influence upon each other. And so it's the same idea here. And of course, Venus is strong, well placed in its own sign in an angle, giving a Malavya yoga. And it was actually in her Venus major period that she became first a TV star in the TV show Dawson's Creek, but then, moved into getting into films. It was actually in a sub-period of Jupiter, activating this Gajikesari Yoga and the other yogas that the Moon and Jupiter also give. It was in the major period of Venus, sub-period of Jupiter, that she really started getting into films and had her most successful role in one of the Batman movies. I believe it was Batman Begins. Never has yet to run the major periods of those planets, but a little later is going to move into the Moon period, and so she'll get more of the full fruit of that yoga. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in her life then. So this may not be a name, this next chart may not be a name you recognize. He was a fairly renowned Mexican writer, author that is, philosopher, and diplomat. Here we see the Moon and Jupiter together again, and again with Jupiter, in this case, not being in its exaltation sign, but being in its own sign as the Lagna Lord. So in all the cases that I've shown you thus far, in the case of Mahatma Gandhi, Jupiter was aspecting on the Lagna. In the case of Stephen Curry, the Moon was the Lagna Lord. In the case of Katie Holmes, whose chart we just saw, Moon and Jupiter are together in the Lagna. And here again in this chart, Moon and Jupiter are together in the Lagna. My point being here is that, as I've mentioned, any yogas, including this yoga, that gets related to the ascendant, that's a notable point in the sense that it becomes very personalized and is an expression, and then becomes something of an expression of who this individual is. I mentioned this person was an author, and that's what he got some of his greatest, notability for. That authorship actually started in his Moon major period. And, anyone who's read my article, A Literary Love Affair, knows that, these two planets oftentimes strongly come into play in the charts of authors, particularly if they're related to either the first house or the fifth house. Here they're related to the first house. And some of the work that which he's most notable for actually happened in the major period of Jupiter, a major period of Moon, sub-period of Jupiter. There is the influence of the Rahu-Ketu axis here, and there's no additional influence of natural benefics. It also gets the aspect of Mars, as you can see here. So it's not as good and high a quality as, say, the Gajikesari yogas in the chart of Mahatma Gandhi and or Stephen Curry. But because of its placement in the Lagna here and the strength of Jupiter, it still becomes a pretty dramatic Gajikesari yoga that did bring an element of making him a very notable person in his society and giving him a certain amount of measure of lasting fame for the authorship and the works that he created that way. What's interesting, something that he wrote was seen as being kind of the beginning of the surrealistic movement in art and the magic realism associated with Mexico and South American artists in particular. So we see the influence of the Rahu-Ketu axis on the Gajikesari yoga, and it would be considered at some level something of an affliction and a blemish on the yoga, but you've probably heard me mention that when Rahu and Ketu are in the signs of benefics as they are here, and under the influence of natural benefics, then they act in a much more benign way, and they're much less in affliction, and can actually be instrumental in creating Raja Yoga themselves. Right? So keeping that in mind here. Now, someone whose name I would think you would recognize also amongst the surrealist artists of that era is the Spanish painter. He was actually, he was an artist in a number of modalities, but most known probably for painting. Salvador Dali. And again, we see a Moon-Jupiter conjunction in Jupiter's sign. This came Pisces, and this time, falling in the 10th house. Not related to the ascendant in this case. And what I find interesting, based on what we just saw in the chart of Alfonso Reyes, his moon and Jupiter are again under the influence of the Rahu-Ketu axis, but again with Rahu-Ketu falling in the signs of benefics, exclusively under the influence of benefics. And his is falling in the 10th house here, and actually it was in his Ketu major period that he first gained worldwide recognition for his art. And the most famous piece that he is famous for, it's called the Persistence of Memory. If you saw it, I'm sure you'd recognize it. It was done in the K2 period. So some of his works for which he's most known were produced by the K2 period, of course, giving the results here of the Gajukeshwara Yoga. Now, we're going to see a different variation of, we've been looking at Moon-Jupiter conjunctions in the signs where Jupiter's either Swakshetra or Ucha, or exalted. Now I'm showing you a chart of another famous basketball player here in the U.S. who has also been multiple times the most valuable player of the Professional Basketball Association here, LeBron James. Now, in his case, Moon is in the sign of Jupiter. And then also Jupiter falls angular here, and Jupiter also falls angular from the Lagna, giving Hamsa Yoga. It doesn't have the influence of additional natural benefics, so it doesn't have that additional favorable qualification. It's with the sun here and not being combust because they're sufficiently far away from each other, giving another yoga called Raja Lakshana Yoga. Raja Lakshana meaning having the characteristics of kingship or nobility. I've always found it interesting that he's actually referred to in the basketball world as the king, having this combination. Again, we see it related to the ascendant because it's aspecting on the ascendant. And, both the moon and Jupiter here powerfully placed in angles. Now, he hasn't, run the major periods of these planets. So it's not part of something that's been in the Dasha sequence as far as major periods. He's been running all of his great successes and recognition and wealth that's resulted from that have come in his Venus Mahadasha, but it was in the sub-period of Venus, activating the Gajukeshwara Yoga, that he was twice MVP, most valuable player, and twice he led his team to the championship. So definitely relates to a peak period in his career life that his Gajukeshwara Yoga is contributing to. Okay, so something I didn't mention, with regards to Stephen Curry, and now I want to mention it also with regards to LeBron James. One of the effects that is said to come about by having a good Gajukeshwara Yoga is that the person, the idea of, virtuous behavior, engaging in virtuous activity, and having, noble ideas and idealism. And, if you look at the history and some biographical information with regards to both Stephen Curry and LeBron James, both of them have been very involved in charitable activities and causes. I'm not sure about LeBron James, but Stephen Curry is very outspoken about his Christian faith. And, so that also can be one of the reflections of a good Gajukeshwara Yoga that, has a strong Jupiter, which pertains to these sorts of things. And so you see the evidence of this kind of manifestation of the yoga in the life of both of these individuals as well. And as I send you this, I give you more information about that. And so having looked at, truly superior, although not, completely unblemished or perfect Gajukeshwara Yogas, I now wanted to look at one that would come under what I would call the blemished, maybe even considerably blemished Gajikeshri yoga that then, modifies the results it can give. The yoga deteriorates quite a bit. So, looking at this chart here, we see, again, as we had in, charts that I was showing you of superior Gajikeshri yogas, we see the moon and Jupiter together in Jupiter's sign, with Jupiter Svakshetra here in its own sign, and also it's the Lagna Lord, so it's very personalized to this individual as well, who's a woman friend of mine, by the way, someone well known to me. But take a look at degrees, take a look at other factors, and notice the problems that are associated with this particular combination. First of all, it doesn't have the additional qualification of having the influence of a natural benefic. Quite the opposite here. You see that Jupiter has a fairly close aspect from Saturn, with natural malefic, of course, and also something of a functional malefic for this Lagna, since it rules a Marika second house and also a Dushtana third house. And then if you look on either side of Jupiter and the moon there, in Pisces in the fourth house, you'll see Rahu on one side and then Mars, Sun, and Mercury on the other, which actually produces malefic hemming. And so this is some really blemishes on this yoga. And then again, if you consider them just the moon, very, very dark Amavasya moon. It's also in a Gandanta degree, 28 degrees, 37 minutes of Pisces, fairly close Gandanta degree, which is, Gandanta affects the moon probably more than any other planet. And you'll see that the moon is the eighth lord here as well, such that, ironically, this combination actually is part of an Arishta yoga as well, because you have the Lagna Lord with the eighth lord, which for this Lagna would not necessarily be a bad thing by itself. But then you add the malefic hemming, and then you add the aspect of Saturn, the natural malefic, who's also a Dushtana lord, and is also a Marika for this Lagna, then it actually does become an Arishta yoga. And therefore, the results of this yoga are going to be quite mixed, and they were. They ran their moon period in their mid 30s, early 40s, around that period, and it did bring some really good manifestations. Being here in the fourth house, not surprisingly, it actually brought her and her husband property for the first time. It actually came about as a result of an inheritance that was received by the couple. You see here the moon is the eighth lord of inheritance and the fourth lord of property with the fourth lord. So, you see that manifestation, and they're actually, with that inheritance, they purchased a home and then purchased another home near there where they used as rental property. So they had two homes. And they were nice homes. Actually, Mr. Rao, in one of the times when he came to teach here in the San Diego area, he housed with them. They put him up, had him in his home, and he commented that the home was like a temple. They're a very spiritually oriented couple, and there was a lot of different statues and iconography related to the Eastern spiritual tradition in their homes, and this is why he made this comment. And it also, interesting enough, brought their second child, another son, into their life. You can see that by virtue of the fact that both from Karaka Lagna, position of Jupiter, and also from Chandra Lagna, the moon is actually the fifth lord from there. And it was actually in Moon Jupiter, I'm getting confused here, Moon Jupiter, that they got the two homes, and also it brought the child. But it activates the Arishta yoga as well. She had a difficult pregnancy. The infant was very difficult, was ill a lot, wasn't sleeping well at all. And it really had an effect and rather ruined her health, actually. She developed, you might say, chronic fatigue system. And prior to the moon period, she'd had, very good, robust health throughout her life. But subsequently, her health has been an issue ever since then. That was back, when she was around 40 years old, and she's now in her mid 60s, and has had, really challenges with her health subsequent to this moon major period that did activate the Arishta for her. So an example of a Gajikeshwari yoga that has some good features to it, but is also quite blemished, and therefore, comes with some other things as well that aren't favorable at all. So, I think most everyone, at least if you live here in the U.S., may recognize this name. It's the name of a very notorious cult leader, Charles Manson, who led a cult that was referred to as the Manson family, that really made headlines back in the summer of 1969, when a group of his followers, on his instigation, committed some horrific murders. This was sensationalized and just, given an enormous amount of media attention, and the subsequent trial involved it as well. And so everybody involved became very, not famous, but rather infamous, including him. And, his is a very fascinating chart in certain ways. Very powerful chart in many, many ways. You can see that every planet but Mars, so 8 out of 9 grahas, are in Kendras, right? And Mars, as the Lagna Lord in the 5th, is strong and well placed in terms of a Lagna Lord. I'm not going to talk about all the yogas that are formed here, but just focusing in on the fact that Jupiter does fall in the 10th house from the moon, besides falling in an angle from the birth lagna as well, right? So the way this yoga and lots of the other yogas in the chart turn rather dark is, if we look at the position of the moon, first of all, it's in the sign of a malefic with that malefic, Saturn in this case, but then also extremely closely conjunct Rahu. Him and his followers were, big drug users. He was delusional, and he got his followers to sort of buy into his delusions. And Saturn, you'll see, aspects all the planets in Libra, including the Jupiter. But what's kind of interesting about this is that in other ways, this is a strong Gajikeshwari yoga. It has that influence of additional natural benefics. It's falling in an angle both from the moon and the birth lagna. It's qualified by being involved in other major yogas, including Saraswati yoga. He actually, his dream was to become a rock star, and he played guitar and actually wrote some songs that got some attention from some groups like from the Beach Boys and so on and so forth. That was, sort of one of his ambitions. You see that as being expression of the Saraswati yoga. But, this all turns rather dark by the real dominating influence of Saturn here, both on the moon and Jupiter and those other benefics. So it's, again, an example of extremely flawed, blemished Gajikeshwari yoga. And then actually the chart of Bill Clinton is another example of a flawed and blemished Gajikeshwari yoga, mostly from the standpoint of what happens with his moon. Of course, you've probably heard me talk about this chart before. Clinton got the presidency in the major period of Jupiter. Jupiter is Vargotama here. And, from Chandra Lagna, the position of the moon in Aries, the moon-Jupiter combination is a combination of the 4th Lord and the 9th Lord, giving a Raja Yoga. And so, there's many other reasons, but, this Gajikeshwari yoga in his chart did contribute to his, gaining such a high status and being such a notable individual. Jupiter doesn't have the additional influence of the natural benefic. It is following Kendra, very closely Kendra, or not very closely, but Kendra to Mercury and Saturn in Cancer. But it's an example of a flawed Gajikeswara yoga that also gave him not just fame, but infamy. If you see here that the moon is in the 8th house, and it's also in a Gandanta position, and it's afflicted. It gets the aspect of both Mars and Saturn here, two planets who are really very functional malefic for this Lagna as well, because of the way in which Mars is the ruler of the 8th house and Saturn is the ruler of the 6th house as its Mula Trikona sign. It can function very malefically, both as a natural malefic and as the lord of those houses, which it did here. And, some of you might be old enough to remember that he had this terrible scandal that marred the second term of his presidency, where it came out that he was having this sexual affair with a very young 22-year-old White House intern, Monica Lewinsky. And, so during the investigation of this and depositions and information that he gave, he was charged by the U.S. House of Representatives on 2 counts, one of perjury and one of obstruction of justice, and that there was a movement towards impeachment, and he was actually impeached by the U.S. House of Representatives. He then went to the U.S. Senate, where he was, by a fairly narrow margin, he was actually acquitted of these charges, and his presidency survived. But all of this was coming down in the major period of, right after he moved into the sub-period of the moon. Major period of Jupiter, sub-period of the moon, is where the revelations about the affairs and his having to address it publicly, December of 1998, I believe it was, started to all unfold. And the entire time when he was, going through this process of being charged with these and being tried for these, supposed, violations of the law, was all happening in this major period of Jupiter, sub-period of the moon. And so, again, the kind of negative results and the kind of, not fame, but infamy that can come about as a result of, a really marred Gajikeswara yoga as his is. Generally his presidency was considered as being hugely successful in so many different ways, but it will forever sort of, have this cloud, this blight of what came out in terms of this affair, and then also the fact that he was nearly impeached. Now, what I've always found fascinating is that at the same time that this was happening, the person that was also at the center of the scandal, Monica Lewinsky, was also running. In his case, it was Jupiter moon. In her case, it was the major period of the moon, sub-period of Jupiter. Then when a lot of this was going on, or the major period of the moon, sub-period of Rahu, which gives the results of Jupiter here, because Jupiter's in Rahu's sign. And her moon, like his, is in the 8th house. It doesn't have the afflictions that his did. It's not in a Gandanta degree, but nonetheless, in the 8th house here, Jupiter's actually in its debilitation sign as the 7th lord, right, of relationships, and Moon's not getting the influence of Mars and Saturn like his is, but both Mars as the 8th lord and Saturn as the 6th lord is influencing her 7th house. So, of course, as a result of this scandal, she became, for a period of time, the obsessive, focus of media attention. Was maybe one of the most recognizable female faces on the planet for a while because of the, extreme amount of coverage. I think it was just at the very end of Moon Rahu and just before she moved into Moon Jupiter that, I'm sure she was paid quite well to appear on an interview with the famed TV journalist Barbara Walters that millions and millions of people all over the world watched, And so it's an example of a Gajukeshwara yoga that is making you prominent, but not necessarily for something that you'd want to be, notable and prominent for. And she'll sort of go down in history related to this incident, right? Not a good thing. So I just showed you 3 examples of Gajukeshwara yogas that are severely blemished, and therefore some of the very mixed results that they can give. I now want you to look at what I would call some ordinary Gajukeshwara yogas, because as I mentioned earlier, this is a very frequently seen combination in birth charts. Theoretically, statistically, as I mentioned earlier, a third of birth charts are likely to have the moon in an angular position from Jupiter. And of course, the vast majority of them aren't going to give the kind of just the results that you see described in the classics, that only come about when the Gajukeshwara yoga is of the superior variety. And this is the typical kind of Gajukeshwara yoga that I would normally see in my day-to-day astrological practices when I was consulting. So you have here again the moon and Jupiter together with each other. You'll see that Jupiter is not falling in an angle from the birth lagna. It doesn't have the additional qualification of the influence of a natural benefic. Its influence with the Rahu-Ketu axis here I would consider only to be a mild blemish because of the way, again, the nodes are in the signs of benefics and under the influence of benefics, but it's still a bit of a blemish. And Jupiter don't have good lordships for her Taurus lagna. This is a chart of a woman friend of mine. Jupiter's a functional malefic for this lagna as the lord of 6, 11, and 8, and the moon is as well, being the lord of the 3rd house. So, and together they don't, just in terms of a combination, as far as their house lordship, don't form a good combination like we saw in a lot of the other earlier Gajukeshwara yogas that I was showing you. And, the Jupiter here does have a source of strength. It's Vargotama. But all in all, this is, not anything like the Gajukeshwara yogas I was showing you initially. And therefore, it's going to give, rather ordinary results. This person ran their Jupiter major period early in life, ages 10 to 26. And, they had a typical sort of Midwestern middle class sort of upbringing. You'll see here that Jupiter's actually a part of Saraswati Yoga, and a reasonably good Saraswati Yoga, given Jupiter's Vargotama status. And so the Gajukeshwara Yoga gets further qualified by Jupiter participating in that. And she did quite well academically, graduated from a good state university with a degree in liberal arts, specializing in actually languages. I'll just mention here that K and Rao had shared with me that Ketu in the 2nd house in particular, or Rahu as well, or connected to the 2nd lord, very often gives foreign languages. She learned a number of foreign languages, but particularly French, and was a language major, which is reflected here. Now, she is going to be moving into her Ketu period coming up soon. She's been running her Mercury major period. I've given her some input, and there is some benefit from this yoga, but it's an ordinary Gajukeshwara yoga, and it's not going to give her some great status or everlasting fame like a good Gajukeshwara yoga can. Now, in some of these charts that I've shown you, though, they do produce, and this one's true too, it does produce kind of some of that, because it's not heavily afflicted, some of that idealism and noble characteristics, virtuous characteristics that can come with this yoga. And that's, if you knew this person, you'd see that's very much a part of who she is. She's someone that whenever she sees an opportunity to help someone or someone who needs help, that she, is inclined to jump in and do what she can. It has more to do with this combination, but this combination is part of it. So I'm showing you, let's see here. Look at this chart. And what's interesting about the Gajukesara Yoga in this chart is that it does have some rather good features. You'll see here that the moon is quite bright, nearly perfectly full, and that it's falling in Jupiter's sign, and that Jupiter is also strongly placed in its own sign as far as its sign placement, falling in the fourth house from the moon. But, and again, Jupiter's not falling at an angle from the birth lagna. It's the 12th Lord in the 12th house. It doesn't have the additional influence of a natural benefic. In fact, quite the contrary. You'll see that it gets the glance of Saturn here. And the moon, besides everything else it's involved in, is in rather an extreme Gandanta, said to be the worst Gandanta for the moon. So, again, in the context of the chart in which this exists, which is, if you look at the Lagna Lord involved in a planetary war there with the sixth Lord, the context of this chart is just not what you'd see as far as the context of the earlier Gajukesara yogas that I was showing you. Now, he did run his moon major period, and it's not as if like that Gajukesara yoga, particularly connected to the 9th house and the 12th house, didn't have some good result from it. He, during that time, actually had a very beneficial association with some very prominent gurus, 9th house in India, 12th house, when he was in India. It was in actually his major period of the moon, sub-period of Jupiter, when that happened. He's actually in his mid-60s now, and then will move into his Jupiter Mahadasha, I believe in 2019 at age 67, something like that. And, I have predicted for him that it's going to bring some beneficial things in his life. He's been a lifelong spiritual seeker, with the moon in the 9th house, and Jupiter with the 9th Lord in the 12th house and its own 12th house. This is a combination that should be good for his spiritual pursuits and could even put him in something of a leadership position that way. But again, in the context of this chart as a whole, and some of what that is characteristic of this Gajukesara yoga that I spoke of, it's not one that has or is going to make him a particularly notable person or give him any level of fame. It certainly has produced a lot of that idealism and noble intentions that can go with this yoga. That's certainly present if you knew this person. And so the last one I want to show you here is of a close friend of mine. And his Gajukesara yoga does share some of the characteristics of some of the more famous individuals that I showed you early, in that his Gajukesara yoga is a combination of Jupiter and the moon strongly placed in the 10th house, right? And, but, think about it, from different angles here. It doesn't get the additional influence of a natural benefic, isn't afflicted by any natural malefics either. But unlike the ones that I was showing you earlier, Jupiter here doesn't have any particular, nor does the moon have any particularly sources of strength coming from some good dignity or some other reason. Here it's in the sign of a neutral. And then if you saw its position in Navamsha, you would see it's actually in the sign of a great enemy. And the moon actually is better configured. You'll actually see it in Taurus, or its exaltation sign in Navamsha. Now, he was actually born, you see here, his moon is in Punarvasa, ruled by Jupiter. So the Vimshotri Dasha, he started in his Jupiter major period. His father was a successful Wall Street stockbroker, and therefore he grew up in fairly affluent circumstances, privileged circumstances, was sent to private schools in New York. They had vacation homes. And so, from a material standpoint and the benefit that he was deriving from the family system that he was born in, this Gajukesara yoga was related to that. And then, later in life, as an adult, he became an ordained swami in the tradition of Kriya Yoga. Professionally, he's been what's called a business coach or a counselor, an executive coach to business executives, corporation executives. Both of those symbols, the priest and the counselor, those are Jupiterian significations. And so the Gajikesara Yoga falling in his 10th house has certainly been related to that. He'd have to live pretty long. He's in his Venus period now. I don't know if he'll ever see his moon period. He gets some more manifestation of that yoga in the major period. But again, context. Think about context. By context, I mean the overall condition of the chart and other factors in the chart, particularly the condition of the Lagna Lord. You see here that his Lagna Lord goes to the 12th with the 12th Lord. The chart I just showed you earlier, the Lagna Lord was in the 2nd house, involved in a planetary war with the 6th Lord, Mercury. Both of it has some sort of Arishta qualities, both this chart and the other chart, as far as the Lagna Lord. So context means a lot. If you go back and you examine the charts of those people who were world-famous personalities, of which the Gajikesara Yoga has really contributed to that, you'll see a much better, stronger placements of the Lagna Lord. So this is some of the ways I wanted to share with you that we qualify this yoga that's seen very commonly, but the true results, the full fruit of the Gajikesara Yoga are rarely seen. And I'm trying to show you here under what conditions those would be seen and what conditions they would typically not be seen, so you can qualify that yoga. So this is the lesson for today. And I'm going to continue with this theme of solar yogas. We'll be looking at 2 solar yogas in the next lesson, both of whom also involve a combination, or they involve the moon and Jupiter. So until then, namaste, everyone, take care, and bye for